There exists a forum beyond that which is known to man. A place that sits between truth and the lies which we choose to believe. A dimension ruled by the shadowy depths of human nature and those who turn a blind eye to it. Submitted for your approval. NoSleep. If you're driving in the mountains, don't listen to your radio. My parents live high up in the mountains, a little to the west of Denver. Last weekend, my fiancée Rachel and I drove up to their house for dinner. I go to school in Colorado Springs, which means I normally drive east of the mountains before heading south on the highway towards my apartment. But this time, when I put my address into my GPS, I noticed there was a slightly faster route that wound back and forth while staying in the mountains. After talking it over with Rachel, we decided to follow the new path. The moon was full, the car had plenty of gas, and we were in an adventurous mood. The beginning of the drive passed without incident. I knew most of the roads near my parents, and the full moon washed everything out with a pale, colorless light that made following the signs easy. The road took us deep into the mountains, and soon the winding path was rough and bumpy from lack of use. We'd been driving for around a half hour when Rachel turned on the radio. Everything was static. "Well, we're in the mountains," I said. "Reception is going to be rough out here." Rachel didn't answer, instead continuing to turn the knob in search of a new station. She stopped the dial when she heard a voice. At first, I thought it was one of those Christian radio stations that play out in the country, you know, the kind that have audio sermons constantly playing. But as I listened, I realized it was something more like a public service announcement. The voice on the radio had a noticeable lisp. "I repeat, all cars driving on Pikes Lane, there is a serious rock slide blocking the road near Adler's Junction. We recommend that all drivers take Manitou Drive as a detour." I looked down at my GPS and saw that we were driving on Pikes Lane, then scrolled along the road until I found a road marked Manitou Drive. "Huh," I said. "Should we just turn around?" Rachel asked. "Well, we've already been driving for half an hour. It'd mean adding an hour till we get home." I tapped the screen to add the turn on my GPS. "Let's see how long this detour is." I turned right onto Manitou. It wound back and forth down into a valley. After another 10 minutes or so, we arrived in a small town. There didn't appear to be any other exit outside of the lone road that carried us there. The only light within 100 feet came from a rundown gas station. My phone didn't have any service, so I pulled into a parking space and walked inside, hoping to get directions to the rest of the detour. The man behind the counter was in his late 50s and smelled horrible. Not just the smell of body odor, but of something worse, like he'd been working with rotting animals a few minutes back. "Hey," I said, "we were driving and got detoured through this town. Is there a way south through here? We're just trying to get to Colorado Springs." An excited smile spread across the man's face. "Oh yeah," he said. "Just keep driving through town." His voice was somehow familiar, but I was too distracted by the smell to give it too much thought. I thanked him for the information, returned to my car, and set off down the road with Rachel. "My friends," the radio crackled. "It is time. We gather at the square." I looked up at Rachel. She was staring at the radio with a concerned expression. Was that the same guy that announced the rock slide? It sounded like it. I continued driving through town, following the path he'd laid out. It came to a dead end with a bunch of trailers. I tried to check the map on my phone, but I still had no service. "Well," I said, "I guess we have to go back." We were driving back along the winding roads through town when my headlights illuminated something blocking the road. I pulled my car to a stop, staring at what was clearly a tied-up woman laying on the ground. I said. "Hey," Rachel said, "drive. Drive fast." I turned to follow her eyes, and no less than 40 dark figures emerged from behind the rundown buildings surrounding us. They were holding candles, and they were running towards our car. I slammed my foot down on the gas, narrowly avoiding the woman tied up, and sped off down the road. The radio crackled to life again. "Come back. Join our celebration." I realized where I recognized it. It was the same man in the gas station. The same man who'd announced the rock slide and brought us into this town to begin with. I didn't stop driving until I reached my parents' place. I looked up some news articles and found several that mentioned drivers going missing near the town we'd driven through. If I find anything else, I'll update you all here. The air is a bit different up there, something I can't quite place. It's not because of the cabin pressure or the circulation, not even the enclosed space. It's like I'm breathing something entirely new, something that fills up my lungs with more than just oxygen. I've always had a thing about airplanes, ever since I was a kid. I remember my first flight, Boston to Chicago O'Hare, Boeing 737, 1974. About 4 hours of flight time. Everything was magic. The feel of the engines roaring to life beside me, my body pressed into the plush seat back, looking down as the earth slowly drifted away until there was nothing left. That's a feeling I haven't stopped chasing. But that's the past. 1974 passed me by many years ago. I can hear a low muffled voice, a creak, and then a soft tap on my shoulder. I look up to see a woman, hair tied back in a tight bun, red neckerchief complementing her eggshell shirt and navy blazer. I can see her lips move. The low hum of the engine slowly fills my ear once more, the chatter of passengers cast around the dim cabin. "Pardon?" I say, a blank look across my face. The flight attendant smiles kindly and repeats, "Can I get you anything to drink? Coffee? Tea? Coffee's fine," I reply. I watch her figure walk back toward the galley, eyeing the passengers behind me, but soon my gaze is recaptured by a soft orange light. As I turn to my left to look out the lightly frosted window, I can see the sun slipping behind the horizon. I can see the coast receding from view as the plane climbs higher into the sky. It's moments like this that make everything seem worth it. My love of airplanes comes with several faults, and becoming a frequent flyer was never as glamorous as the lifestyle my 10-year-old mind had concocted. The exotic destinations and lavish resorts of my dreams were soon replaced by the cold reality of dingy motels and red-eyes into Milwaukee. The debonair swagger I expected my experience to convey was soon taken over by missed piano recitals and birthday calls from distant cities. A waft of steam hits my nose, and I look back up to see the flight attendant returning with my coffee. A sour roast unbefitting of any true connoisseur, but largely necessary for me to push through the onsetting fatigue. I sip at the foam cup. I glance to my right at the man sitting next to me, headphones on, staring ahead. If only I could see what he saw, feel what he felt, experience flight through any eyes other than my own. I could see the last warm glow of the setting sun on the far horizon, but the lens I looked through had grown worn and colored with time. That's another thing I've always loved about flying, that time seemed to stand still. Now, that's usually a bad thing for a fellow traveler who can't wait for touchdown, the type to stand in the aisle the second the seatbelt sign has been turned off, but a break from time is sometimes just what I need. I looked back to my travel companion, a stranger, before takeoff. "First time?" His face remained unchanged. Clearing my throat, I spoke up a bit. First time?" Without turning his head, the man let out a slight chuckle. "Oh no," he said. "Not quite." I realized it was a foolish question for a man that appeared to be in his late 30s, but I couldn't be sure. Not everyone got a chance to fly as frequently as I did. My wife stepped aboard her first airplane the day of our honeymoon, a quick shot down to Florida. I promised I would take her somewhere tropical, but the Palms of Miami were all I could afford then. Maybe if I'd sprung for Cancun, things could have been different. I remember watching her as we took off that night, her eyes glued to the small window, the wing light glinting off her eager gaze as she saw the city disappear beneath us for the first time. But that was long past too. By now, the sun had relieved itself of its daily duties, and a crescent moon had taken its place above us. I can see a floor of clouds beneath, a blanket of stars above. We press onward into the darkening night. I have a family, a beautiful wife, a handsome son. He always wanted to play hockey even if his mother grew up in a die-hard football family. I should have called my wife earlier, but that was obviously impossible by now. She'd understand, I'm sure. She didn't love how much I had to travel for work. It was a fight we had frequently at the beginning of the marriage. I told her that I'd work my way up. I told her I wouldn't have to do this much longer. I told her I'd be home. I told my son I'd be home. And I will be, I just haven't gotten there quite yet. I'm pulled from my thoughts by a low hum as the PA system comes to life.
"Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot speaking. Despite a delayed takeoff, we've made up some time on the back end and should be landing at around 11:35 local time, right on schedule. We thank you again for flying with us and hope you enjoy the last hour or so in the friendly skies."
As the PA cuts off with a light static, I turn back toward my seatmate. "Ahead of schedule, huh? I'm ready to be home, that's for sure," I say in a casual sort of way, more speaking my thoughts than initiating conversation. "Looks like it," he replied, curt but to be expected. No matter, I should be focusing on my own work anyway, and a passing conversation would only complicate that. An hour till we land. One more hour where time stands still, where the air is thin and crisp, where my problems lay miles below me. One more hour. People measure time differently on airplanes. Some set their watches to their destination when they take their seats, others take a pill to forget the ordeal, and the rest measure the passing minutes merely by how many episodes they've watched. While I've spent more hours than I'd care to admit in the quiet comfort of mindless sitcoms, I never watch TV on airplanes anymore. Another tap on my shoulder once more drew me out of my head and back to reality, and I waved off the offer for another beverage, choosing not to enter a battle of sound that would undoubtedly be lost to the rush of the air, the vibration of the engine, the rattle of the drink cart. 45 minutes to go, I thought. By now the sky had completely darkened save for the heavens that shone down, unknown constellations meeting my gaze with equal intensity. I tightened my grip slightly as I faintly heard the PA system inform the full flight of upcoming turbulence. Looking down, I realized that my knuckles are a pale white, tightly gripping the cold, rough plastic. I can feel the understated vibrations of the cabin fade away as I slip back into a memory. I look to my right and I see my son, eyes wide, mouth curled into an eager grin as he awaits his first takeoff. It's 3 years after 9/11 and the friendly skies have become anything but. Yet in the eyes of a child, the magic was still there. I can feel him wrap his hand around my wrist as the plane comes to life, beginning its race down the runway. I should have called my son, I thought, but that was obviously impossible now. The cold metal of my wristwatch reminds me of the final approach. 30 minutes to go. We should be descending by now. At this rate, I'll be home before I know it. It'll be nice to see my wife and son. It feels like it's been far too long since I've held them in my arms. The man sitting next to me begins to cough, and I pass him a cloth to use. That's how you get sick on an airplane, you know. Somebody coughs, the air recycling system spreads it around the plane, and before you know it, you're home with the flu. Well, that's what my mom used to tell me, at least. I learned quickly that airplane air systems don't work like that, but I'm not taking any chances. The man has stopped coughing, and I breathe a sigh of relief. The quiet's welcome. My mom would be proud, I think. She wouldn't be here to see that, of course. Not every 56-year-old man has his mother around anymore. I remember flying to her funeral. The night sky blended with my dark suit, and I felt truly alone. 15 minutes to go. Less than a full episode of The Office, and I'd be with my family. I hear a low banging coming from behind me, but I don't turn around. Airplanes are like that sometimes. Kids kick and scream, people get luggage from the overhead bins when they aren't supposed to, the engines can make funny noises. You learn to live with it. I glance at the dim flicker of the light above my seat, the dark abyss out of the window to my left, and the man sitting to my right, whose head has appeared to have slumped into an uneasy sleep. 15 minutes, I thought to myself. 15 minutes. I've been trying to get home for a while, and this time I was finally gonna stay. You know how it is. Work can be demanding sometimes. You start in New York, you end up in Phoenix, a layover in Denver, a brief stop in LA, back to Phoenix, and before you know it, your kid just turned 5. Your wife is pregnant again. Your mom got admitted to the hospital. I've carried guilt for a long time. All I ever wanted to do was provide for my family, give them the life I knew they deserved, but I know it wasn't enough. I know that I was in an airport Holiday Inn on the south side of Charleston when my wife celebrated our anniversary alone. I remember the cold plastic phone receiver pressed to my ear as my son told me about his first home run. I felt proud that I could give them a home, that I could feed them, that I could keep them healthy, but it wasn't enough. I wasn't enough. I wasn't there to tuck him in. I wasn't there to kiss her goodnight. I wasn't there to stop the car that swerved into their lane, but that was years ago, almost another lifetime. The life I live on the ground is different. The life I live on the ground is painful. When I land, when I close the door to another beige-walled hotel room, I could only remind myself of the fact that I was at more funerals for my son than birthdays. I wasn't there to celebrate his life, and that's a regret I've carried for the last decade. I know she tried. I know she did everything she could, but the crumpled driver's side door didn't care. I told her that I'd be home 30 years ago, and I was finally going to fulfill that promise. I opened my eyes suddenly, taking in a deep breath. The sound of the airplane begins to overwhelm my senses. I've had to fly a lot for work, so you think I'd be used to it. But this was different. The hum of the engine set a steady backdrop for the sounds that broke out around me. The banging behind me began to crescendo, but I paid it no heed. The lights above me blinked incessantly, beckoning me to pay them any bit of attention, but I kept my eyes locked forward, my hands steady. I wasn't worried about the banging sound. It would stop soon enough. I took another look at the co-pilot to my right. Some blood had begun dripping out of his nose, but he was still unconscious. I returned my gaze to the main windshield, and I watched as the coast came into view. 5 minutes to go. I began to pull hard right, and the banging behind me increased in intensity. More warning lights began flashing on the instrument panels around me, but I needn't worry about them. I've had to fly for work for decades. I know what I'm doing. 4 minutes to go. I begin to smile. I haven't seen my son in quite a long time. I wonder if he still likes Star Wars. I wonder if he still plays with Legos. I thought about getting him a gift before I took off, but I didn't want to embarrass myself. 3 minutes to go. I really do wish I had called my wife. I've thought about that every night for the last 10 years. I think back to that flight, and I wish that I had called her before I had taken off. 2 minutes to go. The shimmering firmament twinkles above me. The black abyss waits below. 1 minute. The PA system crackles to life once more.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're now in our final approach.
I want to keep falling. Lung cancer, stage 3, inoperable. Those are the words that spelled out my ultimate fate, and while it wouldn't be a particularly original way to die, the irony wasn't lost on me. I'd never touched a cigarette during my short lifespan, despite growing up in a household where pretty much everyone inhaled those toxic fumes, including my own parents. Of course, they were both live and healthy. Even to this day, they never suffered any consequences for any of their unhealthy habits, not even a dent put in their lung capacity. Destiny truly is a fickle bit. There I sat at the doctor's office, speechless after hearing the diagnosis. I'd just gone in for a persistent cough from what I thought would be nothing more than a common cold. In all honesty, I didn't feel that sick, but my wife had convinced me to go for a checkup regardless, and because of that checkup, I'd just been told that in less than a year, I would be dead. I'd never been much of a religious person. If asked, I'd put myself somewhere on the agnostic spectrum of not knowing what the hell is going on. That being said, I didn't fear death. I had spent one too many nights thinking about my eventual departure from this world and had accepted that life was a precious resource that would inevitably expire. I just didn't think it would be so soon. My one true quarrel with death was leaving my family behind at the not-so-ripe old age of 42. I still hadn't saved up enough money to keep us afloat in case of emergency, and while my wife still worked, neither of us made enough to support a child on our own, and it just so happened we had a 10-year-old son together. That's why I started praying, begging, bargaining for a second chance. Each night I tried a different god, desperately looking for otherworldly answers, regardless of religion or relevance in modern society. I was desperate. The doctors offered a combo treatment of radiation and chemotherapy. Of course, none would extend my life in any meaningful way, but I started the treatment nonetheless, hoping that maybe someone could offer a miracle cure. But of course, my hopes were left unanswered. In the beginning of this year, my body had deteriorated to the point where I was nothing but a loose sack of skin draped over a malformed set of bones. I knew I only had a few weeks left before the cancer that had gestated within me, growing with each passing day, finally won the battle. When breathing became little more than an agonizing chore serving only to initiate a cascade of painful coughs, I ended up bedridden next to an oxygen tank. Then, finally, on July 29th, 2019, as I tried to get dressed and make the short journey from my bed to the little breakfast table down the hall in my hospital, everything suddenly disappeared beneath my feet. I started falling. 1 second, I was traversing the hospital hallway, oxygen tank dragging on behind me, and with a final gasp, my brain was simply erased from existence. The memory of my disease was nothing more than a faint dream, and my life became a part of a very distant past. I had died, I realized that much, but the concepts of life and death themselves meant little to me in the grand scheme of things. Yes, I had been a part of society on Earth, a note in the everlasting symphony of life, but my part had passed and the song continued on without me, while I moved on to the next stage. I floated, or sank, it was hard to tell directions apart in my new weightless state. It almost seemed like an ocean. The deep blue hues surrounding me on all sides with bubbles of flickering light floating by, delightfully circling around me as I moved towards the brightest thing I'd ever seen. Though the light was blinding, I could sense other beings surrounding me. I turned to look at them, squinting my eyes to get a better grasp of what they were. They didn't resemble any creature ever walking upon Earth's surface, but I could tell they had once been human just like myself. They were happy, smiling without having faces, voicelessly laughing. I waved at them, and they greeted me using nothing more than the warmth of their souls. I still had my body, not yet processed by the afterlife, but I felt healthy, no longer ravaged by the tumors within my chest. Once I got close enough to feel the heat of the light, my periphery darkened, and the joyful creature dancing around me had been replaced by shadows staring intently at my passing. The new creatures weren't people, but beings emitting the most dreadful sense of sadness and anger. They hated me for being able to touch the light, while they were forever trapped in the shadows. One of them reached out for me, its arms stretching impossibly far beyond its confinement. It grabbed onto my leg, pitch-black nails digging into my flesh, tearing muscle from bone as I silently cried in agony. Before I could get a grasp of my situation, another pair of hands grabbed my arm, tearing it straight from its socket. A third pair wrapped around my chest, digging deep into my lungs, rummaging around where the tumors had once lived. More hands joined in, and before long I was enveloped by hundreds of shadows, all tearing away at my limbs and organs, but as all meat was stripped away from my body, the hands had nothing more to hold on to, and I was let go. I was jolted awake, back in the hospital, grasping pathetically for air as the cancer once more inhabited most of my lung tissue. My family stood close by, sobbing at my demise. I really had died, but only for a minute. Silence quickly filled the room as they noticed I was still alive, doctors wearing shocked expressions and horrified stares from my son. They were surprised, confused, as no attempt had been made to resuscitate me. My death had been expected for so long that keeping me alive would be nothing more than a cruel joke. Yet, once again, I lived. I had been so close to eternal salvation, but something had pulled me away, denied my entrance to whatever lay beyond. Of course, with the cancer relentlessly spreading throughout my body, I wasn't meant to stay. Despite the bittersweet taste of my revival, the locals hailed it as a miracle, and multiple news stations wanted to share my story, profit from it. I promptly declined. I didn't want to tell anyone what I saw on the other side, and I was in too much pain to accept it as a miracle. As I stabilized, they moved me to a hospice care facility. Death was still lingering around the corner, but they said I might have a couple more weeks to spend with my family, if nothing more. They'd already said goodbye once, and now that cruel trick of nature made them do it twice. My wife didn't smile once in the following days. She wore a tired expression on her face. Her eyes were sunken, but I couldn't blame her. Taking care of a dying man is no easy task, much less for someone that has to do it twice. My son, on the other hand, would not stop crying. He was too young to understand, but he knew I wouldn't stay for much longer. 2 weeks came and went in the blink of an eye, each day spent in misery, dreading what waited on the other side. Then, one morning, I simply didn't wake up. Once again, the world was done with me. I had been tossed away from existence, and just like before, I started following through time and space into an infinite void. The shapeless being still floated in the periphery as lights that once wandered the earth, but this time there were no smiles to greet me, no joy filling my soul to the brim. They were angry at me. I had returned to a place I didn't belong, and now my journey was no longer a welcome one. I was pushed further towards the light, away from the once blissful companions, but it wasn't long before I saw the shadows again. There the light lingered, just out of reach, so close I could almost reach it, when a pair of twisted hands grabbed onto me, digging into my flesh. This time they didn't settle with violence. They started whispering, begging for me to pull them out of their prisons, to take them with me. Millions of voices rushed through my head, promising it was all a misunderstanding, that they had not meant to hurt me. They wanted nothing more than the warmth of the light. Yet with their pleas for salvation, they tore into me, ripping me apart from within. I couldn't help them. I didn't know how, and with that, their voices turned from prayers to anger. They shouted obscenities from within my head, filling it with hatred while telling me what would happen to my family once I truly perished. In a split second, a vision of my family's future became burned into my memory as if it had already happened. Depression would force my wife out of her job and into a battle with drug addiction, which eventually melted over to our son as he grew up. Unable to escape, my son would get expelled from school after school, ruined by the death of his father and his absent-minded mother. At the age of 16, my son would get into drugs himself and ultimately die in a horrific car crash. That was the summary, a cascade of events that followed my death, but the shadows didn't stop there. They promised a way out, that they could save me and my family if I only took them with me towards the light, but I could never reach the light. As desperately as I longed to just move on, I could never quite get there, always torn to shreds long before I touched it. Each brief visit to the promised afterlife left me nothing more than a barren fragment of thought, alone in a world that didn't belong to me. No matter what they did, nothing happened, and suddenly I was once again dragged away from the light, back to an excruciating life. Since my diagnosis, I've died a total of 16 times. Each time I'm further ripped apart by the shadows, each time rejected by the light and flung back to my cancer-riddled body. My family had grown tired of my presence. My once loving wife loathes my very existence, and my son is beyond traumatized. I can barely move, I can't feed myself, and I need help just getting from bed to the toilet. Because by now the cancer has spread everywhere. The doctors say I couldn't possibly be alive, yet here I am. It's even starting to eat away at my brain as well, taking not only my physical body but the memory of what I used to be along with it. I prayed, begged, and bargained for more time with my family, and I guess something answered. As a result, I was given infinite life, just not a functioning body to go with it. But infinite agony isn't what truly haunts me, nor the fact that I've been rejected by the afterlife itself, because soon I won't have a mind to worry with. What truly frightens me is I now see the shadows while I'm awake. I hear their whispers at night as the pain medication slowly lulls me to sleep. They're thanking me, because in their whispers of lies and deceit, their false desires of entering the light, what they really wanted was our world, and by returning to life, I've brought them here. They needed me to survive. They needed a vessel to come here and extinguish the light we live in, to take away the small amount of happiness that still exists on Earth. They've already taken mine, infecting my family with their horrific purpose and desires. I thought my wife had simply suffered one too many days due to my disease, but it's the shadow within her that has turned her to the hateful creature she's become. She went from a loving spouse taking care of me in my darkest days to spewing vile hatred in my direction for each time I returned from death. She hated me, and she hated my son for being a part of me. Every day she would laugh at my agony, telling me that I hadn't done anything right. I couldn't even die properly. In between the barrages, she let it slip who she had really become. She thanked me for releasing her from the dark abyss, smiling wide as she did. It wasn't her talking. It was the creatures. Of course, my son had become infected too. He quickly followed after my wife, when he stopped speaking and eating, only rotting away in his room, neglected by his sick mother. Once he had become as emaciated and weak as myself, he finally spoke, telling me this would only be the beginning. Soon the rest would come through, another shadow for each trip I took to the beyond. I'm stuck in my broken body, watching everything I love fade away, so I'm writing all of this down in an attempt at warning everyone of what exists beyond the boundaries of life. I need my last deed to be something remotely useful before my mind vanishes with the rest of my decaying body. Perhaps my only hope is to destroy my body, break down everything that I am so that no shadow can infest me, but I'm too weak, too frail to even leave my bed. Please don't spread darkness. I'm sorry for bringing it here, and my punishment is to stay alive and watch, half-witted and broken, when all I want is to simply leave this place. I want to keep falling.